On a summer morning in 1973, a deaf nun in the north of Japan looked down at her left hand and found a wound in the shape of a cross cut into her palm. It had not been there the day before. Within days, it began to bleed, and the pain was sharp enough that she could barely close her fingers. She was 42 years old. She could not hear a single sound in the world around her, and she had entered her convent only weeks before, in a quiet town that almost nobody outside Japan had ever heard of. Her name was Sister Agnes Sasagawa. What happened to her over the following months would be examined by doctors, filmed by a national television crew, tested in a university laboratory, and studied by a Catholic bishop for years before he put his name to a decision most Catholics today have never heard him make. A future pope would reportedly say that the warning she received was, in its heart, the same warning given at Fatima. But before any of that, there was only a woman who could not hear, a wooden statue of Mary, and a voice she said spoke to her when everything else had gone silent. Almost everyone who cares about Catholic prophecy knows Fatima. The three shepherd children in Portugal in 1917, the crowd of thousands, the sun that witnesses swore moved in the sky. Far fewer know that there is another approved apparition of Mary, one that happened in living memory, in a wealthy modern country, to a grown woman whose experiences were written down as they occurred. And fewer still can tell you what the church actually said about it, because the truth is more precise, and honestly, more interesting, than the way it usually gets repeated online. So here is what we are going to do. We are going to start with who this woman was, because her life before the convent is stranger than most people expect. Then we are going to walk through the 3 messages she said she received, word for word, including the one that has unsettled people for 50 years. We are going to look at the statue that wept, and what happened when a scientist tested what came out of it. And we are going to get to the bottom of the phrase everyone repeats and almost nobody checks, approved by the church. Because the story of who approved it, and what exactly they approved, is the part that changes how you hear everything else. Start with the woman, not the wonder. She was born in Japan in 1931, and her name then was Katsuko Sasagawa. Her family was Buddhist. There was no Catholicism in her childhood at all, no quiet Christian grandmother in the background, none of the setup you might expect from someone who ends up at the center of a Marian apparition. She was, by the accounts of the people who knew her, an ordinary girl from an ordinary home, except that she was not physically strong, and her body was about to betray her in a way that shaped the rest of her life. As a young woman, she went into the hospital for what should have been a routine operation, an appendectomy. Something went wrong. A medical error during that surgery left her paralyzed, and not for a few weeks or a few months. She was bedridden for around 16 years. Think about what that means for a person. She entered that hospital young, and she came out of that long ordeal having lost most of her 20s and more, watching the world move on from a bed she could not leave. And here is where the story turns, quietly, the way real turning points usually do. During those years of treatment, she was cared for by a nurse, a Christian woman. And that nurse did 2 things. She helped Katsuko toward recovery, and she introduced her to the faith she had never been raised in. One account says the nurse gave her water from Lourdes, the French shrine, to drink. Whatever the exact chain of events, the paralyzed Buddhist woman slowly came back to her feet, and somewhere in that long recovery, she decided she wanted to give her life to the God she had only just met. She was baptized a Catholic and took the name Agnes. Her family was not thrilled. Converting from the faith of your parents is never a small thing, and doing it to become a nun is even less so. But she went ahead anyway. She joined a religious community, and later, in 1969, she entered a small institute known as the Handmaids of the Eucharist. A few years after that, in the spring of 1973, she arrived at a new and tiny convent on a hillside, at Yuzawadai, on the edge of the city of Akita, in the snowy north of the country. It was home to only a handful of sisters. That detail matters for what comes next, because in a house that small, there was nowhere to hide a secret, and no crowd to get swept up in. She arrived there completely deaf. Her hearing had been failing, and earlier that same year, It had collapsed entirely. Doctors examined her and told her the deafness was progressive and could not be cured. So picture the woman at the start of this story clearly, because the picture matters. She was in her early 40s. She had already lost 16 years of her life to a hospital bed. She had left her family's religion, taken a new name, and given herself to a life of prayer. And now, she had lost her hearing for good, arriving at a convent where she could not even hear the bell that called her to chapel. That is who was standing in that building when the strange things began. They began about a month after she entered. On the 12th of June 1973, Sister Agnes was in the chapel when a brilliant light poured out of the tabernacle, the small locked box on the altar where Catholics keep the consecrated host. It was not a candle, and it was not the sun through a window. It happened more than once over those days, and other sisters would later describe a kind of haze, almost like incense smoke, hanging around the altar. For a community this small and this new, that alone was enough to frighten people. But the light was only the opening. Later that month, on the 28th of June, the wound appeared. On the palm of her left hand, 2 red marks formed the clear shape of a cross. Witnesses said it looked as if it had been carved into the skin. Within a couple of days, it started to bleed, and it hurt badly. This is the wound we opened with. It was not a private, invisible, take my word for it experience. The other sisters saw it. It bled in front of them. And it did not heal quickly. It stayed with her, painful, through the summer, and did not close over until around the end of September. Now, the Church has a name for a wound like this: stigmata, marks that resemble the wounds of Christ, appearing on a living person. And the Church is famously slow and cautious about them, because the history of these claims is full of frauds and delusions, and honest mistakes. So keep that caution in your mind, because it is exactly the caution the bishop would later apply. For the sisters in that house, in the summer of 1973 though, caution was hard to hold on to, because the deaf woman with the bleeding cross on her hand was about to tell them she had heard a voice. It was the 6th of July. According to her own account, she was woken in the very early morning, around 3, by the presence of her guardian angel. The angel told her not to be afraid and said something simple and steadying: "I am the one who is at your side and who guards you." And then Sister Agnes was drawn to the chapel, to the statue of Mary that stood in that convent, a wooden carving of the Virgin standing on a globe in front of a cross. And from the direction of that statue, she said, a voice spoke to her, a woman's voice, gentle, and she could hear it. Remember that she was medically, incurably deaf. She said she heard these words anyway. The first message was, in a way, the most personal of the 3. The voice spoke to her about her deafness and made her a promise. Your deafness will be healed, be sure. Think for a moment about what those 4 words would mean to a woman a doctor had just told would never hear again. Then the voice taught her a prayer and asked her and her sisters to hold on to certain words about Jesus being truly present in the Eucharist, to add that one word, truly, and to mean it. And it ended by asking her to pray, and to have others pray, very much for the Pope, the bishops, and the priests. That last line is worth marking, because it comes back. Every one of the 3 messages, in the middle of everything else, keeps circling back to the same request. Pray for the clergy. Pray for the Church's own. There was something else that day, the statue itself. On the right hand of that wooden carving of Mary, in the same place where Sister Agnes carried her own wound, a wound appeared on the statue, and it too seemed to bleed. So now you had 2 hands marked in the same convent, one of flesh and one of wood, and a community of nuns trying to understand what on earth was happening in their little house on the hill. And this is the part that gets lost when people rush to the scary prophecy. Before Akita was a warning about the end of the world. It was a very small, very human scene. A handful of women, a deaf sister, a wooden statue, and a fear none of them had the words for. The second message came on the 3rd of August. If the first was personal, this one opened outward, toward the whole world, and it introduced the theme that sits underneath the entire Akita story: reparation. The voice said that many people in this world afflict the Lord, and that it desired souls who would console him and soften the anger of the Heavenly Father. It asked for souls willing to repair, through their own suffering and their own poverty, for the sins of others, for the sinners and the ungrateful. It said that prayer, penance, and courageous sacrifice were what could actually soften the Father's anger, which turns the whole thing from a threat into something closer to an offer. And it spoke to Sister Agnes about the vows of religious life, poverty, chastity, and obedience, and about the cost of living them all the way to the end. Now you can hear a message like that two ways. You can hear only the words about anger and punishment and brace yourself. Or you can hear what is actually being asked, which is not doom for its own sake. It is a request for people to voluntarily stand in the gap and pray and sacrifice on behalf of others. That is an old and deeply Catholic idea, the notion that one person's prayer and suffering can be offered for someone else's sake. Hold that thought, because the third message is the one people quote, and it is heavy, and it is easy to quote the darkness and skip the reason the darkness was revealed at all. The third message was given on the 13th of October 1973, and that date is not an accident, or at least it did not feel like one to the people who received it. The 13th of October is the anniversary of the day in 1917, when tens of thousands of people at Fatima said they watched the sun move in the sky. 56 years later to the day, in a convent on the other side of the planet, a deaf Japanese nun said the Mother of God spoke to her for the last time in this series, and gave her the words that have followed Akita ever since. Here is what she said the voice told her. Listen well, because I am going to give it to you closely, without dressing it up and without adding to it. My dear daughter, listen well to what I have to say to you. You will inform your superior. As I told you, if men do not repent and better themselves, the Father will inflict a terrible punishment on all humanity. It will be a punishment greater than the deluge, such as one will never have seen before. Fire will fall from the sky and will wipe out a great part of humanity, the good as well as the bad, sparing neither priests nor faithful. The survivors will find themselves so desolate that they will envy the dead. Sit with how stark that is. Not a punishment for the wicked, while the righteous watch safely from a distance. The good as well as the bad, neither priests nor faithful spared. This is not a comfortable message, and it was never meant to be, but the voice did not stop on the fire. It offered, in the same breath, what it called the only weapons that would remain. The only arms which will remain for you will be the rosary and the sign left by my son. Each day, recite the prayers of the rosary. With the rosary, pray for the Pope, the bishops, and the priests. There it is again. Pray for the clergy. The same request, for the third time. And then came the part that has made this message impossible to ignore for 50 years. The part about the church itself. The work of the devil, the voice said, will infiltrate even into the church, in such a way that one will see cardinals opposing cardinals, and bishops against bishops. The priests who venerate me will be scorned and opposed by their own. The church and its altars will be vandalized. The church will be full of those who accept compromises, and the demon will press many priests and consecrated souls to leave the service of the Lord. The demon, it said, will be especially relentless against souls consecrated to God. Read that in 1973, and it would have sounded almost unthinkable. Cardinals against cardinals, bishops against bishops. The church attacked from inside itself, not by outside armies but by its own. Whatever you personally believe about where those words came from, you cannot deny that Catholics reading them today, watching the divisions inside their own church, feel the hair go up on their arms. And I want to be careful here, because this is exactly where people go too far. To say that these words describe tensions Catholics argue about now is an observation. To claim that any specific modern event is the precise fulfillment of a prophecy is an interpretation, and it is one the Church has never made. The message is what it is. What it means for this year, or this decade, is something no honest person can hand you as a fact. If a story like this is the reason you clicked, then know that the messages are only half of it, and consider subscribing, because it genuinely helps this channel keep telling these accounts in full instead of in fragments. Now, back to that convent. because the words were only the beginning of what people could actually see. The statue was about to do something that a scientist would eventually test in a laboratory. The wooden Virgin in that chapel had been carved a decade earlier, in 1963, by a local Akita craftsman named Saburo Wakasa. He had modeled it on an image called the Lady of All Nations. It was not a famous statue. It was not old. It was not precious. It was a plain wooden carving in a small convent. And beginning on the 4th of January 1975, more than a year after the messages ended, that plain wooden carving began to weep. Not once. Not as a one-time event that a skeptic could wave away as a leak or a trick of condensation. The tears formed at the eyes and ran down the face of the carving, and the sisters watched it happen again and again, over a span of years, sometimes with visiting pilgrims and priests standing in the very same room. By the time it stopped, on the 15th of September, 1981, the statue had wept on 101 separate occasions. 101. And these were not all private moments in a locked chapel. In 1978, a Japanese national television crew filmed the statue weeping, and ordinary people across the country saw it on their screens, tears running down the face of a wooden figure of Mary in a convent most of them had never heard of. And this is where Akita does something that very few apparition stories can do. It walked into a laboratory. Samples were taken, of the tears from the statue, and of blood and what looked like perspiration that the statue had also produced. Those samples were sent to be analyzed by Professor Kaoru Sagisaka, a specialist in forensic medicine at Akita University. He was not asked to prove a miracle. He was asked to identify a substance, the way he would identify a substance in any other case that crossed his desk. His finding was that the samples were human. Not paint, not tree sap, not water. Human blood, human sweat, human tears, from a carved piece of wood. And there was a detail stranger still. The blood tested as one type, type B, while the sweat and the tears tested as another, type AB. Now I want to be careful about what this does and does not prove. It does not, by itself, prove anything about God. A laboratory can tell you that a fluid is human blood of a certain type. It cannot tell you how it came to be running down the cheek of a statue. The Church has been careful never to declare the exact nature of these events as a matter of doctrine. But set the caution aside for 1 second, and just look at the plain situation. A wooden statue, weeping human tears, 101 times, some of it on national television, tested by a university professor who confirmed it was human. That is not nothing. That is the kind of thing that makes a serious person stop and look harder. Which is precisely what one particular serious person did, because none of this, the wound, the voice, the weeping, the laboratory result, would mean what it means today if a Catholic bishop had not decided to spend years of his life investigating it. His name was Bishop John Shojiro Ito, and he led the diocese of Niigata, which included Akita. And Bishop Ito did something that is easy to say and very hard to do. He refused to rush in either direction. He did not stand up and proclaim a miracle the first time he heard about a weeping statue, which would have been reckless. And he did not dismiss it as hysteria from a suggestible nun, which would have been the easy, safe, career-protecting move. Instead, he investigated. For years, he set up more than one commission. He consulted doctors and scientists. He had Sister Agnes herself examined, and he weighed the medical facts against the claims. And here is a piece that gets left out of the triumphant online versions. The first serious inquiry did not hand him a clean verdict. An early commission came back far from convinced, and a lesser man might have let the whole embarrassing affair fade away. Bishop Ito did not let it fade. He kept going, and he went all the way to Rome to consult the office in the Vatican responsible for exactly these questions, the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. And then, on the 22nd of April, 1984, Bishop Ito made his decision. His pastoral letter put a number on the ordeal. These facts, it said, established after 11 years of investigation, are undeniable. 11 years. That is how long this bishop spent on a weeping statue and a deaf nun in a small northern convent, before he was willing to commit himself in writing. He recognized the supernatural character of the series of events connected to the statue of Mary at Akita, and he authorized the veneration of Our Lady of Akita throughout his diocese. In plain terms, he told his people that they were permitted, as Catholics, to honor Mary under this title, and to treat what happened here as genuine. But now I have to slow you down, because this is the exact point where the internet gets it wrong, and where being precise makes the story stronger rather than weaker. When you read that Akita was approved by the Church, that is true, but it does not mean what a lot of people assume it means. It was not a decree from the Pope. It was not a formal judgment handed down by the Vatican declaring a proven miracle that all Catholics everywhere must accept. It was the decision of the local bishop, Bishop Ito, for his own diocese, which is exactly the level at which the Catholic Church says these judgments belong. And Ito himself was careful about its limits. He described the events as private revelation, which in Catholic teaching means something specific. It is not part of the core faith. No Catholic is required to believe in Akita to be a Catholic in good standing. He also made clear he was acting while awaiting any future definitive judgment from the Holy See. I know that sounds at first like a downgrade. Like I just told you, the big Vatican stamp does not exist. But think about it the other way around. This is a bishop who had every incentive to either grab headlines or bury the whole awkward business. And instead, he did the slow, unglamorous, honest thing. He investigated for years, he admitted when early results were not conclusive. He consulted Rome, and then he approved only what he was actually entitled to approve, and he named its limits out loud. That is not the behavior of a man selling a miracle. That is the behavior of a man trying very hard to tell the truth. The modest, carefully bounded nature of that approval is exactly what makes it worth taking seriously. Which brings us to the piece everyone wants to talk about, and the piece you have to handle most carefully of all: the future Pope. In the 1980s, the head of that Vatican office, Bishop Ito, had consulted. The Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith was Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger, the same man who, years later, would be elected Pope Benedict XVI. And the story goes that Ratzinger personally confirmed Akita, and even said it carried the same message as Fatima. So let us separate what is documented from what is reported, because the difference matters. What is reasonably documented is this. In 1988, Bishop Ito met with the congregation, and Cardinal Ratzinger indicated that he had no objection to the bishop's 1984 pastoral letter. In other words, the future Pope, in his role as the Church's guardian of doctrine, let the local approval stand, rather than overturning it. That is real, and it is significant. But notice what it is not. It is not a separate Vatican decree proclaiming Akita from Rome. No such formal document appears to exist, and it is important not to pretend otherwise. Then there is the more dramatic claim, the one you will see quoted everywhere. That Ratzinger said Akita and Fatima are essentially the same message. That line traces back to Howard D., a former ambassador of the Philippines to the Holy See, who said that Cardinal Ratzinger told him personally, in private, that the two messages were essentially the same. D. described this in an interview in the late 1990s, and I have to be straight with you about what that is. It is a reported private remark, remembered and relayed by one man who was in the room. It is not a signed statement. It is not a Vatican document. It is not something Ratzinger himself published. It may well be exactly true. Ambassador D. had no obvious reason to invent it, and it fits with the fact that Ratzinger let the approval stand. But an honest telling has to call it what it is: reported, credible, and human, not decreed. And that distinction between what was formally approved and what was privately reported is the whole discipline this story demands, because it would be so easy to flatten all of it into one triumphant line. The Vatican confirmed Akita, and the Pope said it was Fatima all over again. That version is cleaner, it is more shareable, and it is not accurate. The accurate version is quieter. A local bishop, after years of careful investigation, approved the apparition for his diocese. The future Pope, in his official capacity, let that approval stand. And separately, a diplomat reported that the same future Pope told him in private that Akita echoed Fatima. Every one of those statements is defensible, Stacking them into something bigger than the sum is where people cross from history into legend. So what actually happened to the woman at the center of all of it? Remember the promise from the very first message, back in July of 1973. Your deafness will be healed, be sure. Sister Agnes had received that promise while medically, incurably deaf, unable to hear the voice she said was speaking to her, except by some means no doctor could explain. And in the years that followed, her hearing was restored. The community understood it as the keeping of that promise, the small personal miracle folded inside the enormous public one. The woman who was told her deafness would be healed was healed. After the approval, she did not become a celebrity, and she did not want to. She lived on at the convent, out of view, for decades. She reported further experiences over the years, and those later chapters have their own controversies and their own stories, ones we are going to take apart carefully in the videos still to come, because they deserve their own full telling and not a rushed paragraph here. What matters for the foundation is this. She outlived nearly every other famous visionary of the modern age. And on the 15th of August, 2024, the Feast of the Assumption, the day Catholics honor Mary, being taken up body and soul into heaven, Sister Agnes Sasagawa died. She was 93 years old. Of all the days on the calendar for the seer of a Marian apparition to die, she died on the greatest Marian feast of the year. Make of that what you will. The people who loved her certainly made something of it. So step back and look at the whole shape of it now that you have it all. A Buddhist girl, paralyzed for 16 years by a doctor's mistake, brought back to her feet by a Christian nurse. A convert who lost her hearing and entered a convent in silence. A cross that opened on her hand. A voice she heard when she could hear nothing else. 3 messages, each one circling back to a plea to pray for priests and bishops. A wooden statue that wept human tears 101 times, on national television, confirmed in a laboratory. A bishop who investigated for years and approved only what he could honestly approve. And a future pope who let it stand, and who reportedly said it was Fatima's warning, spoken again. And here is why it lands the way it does, right now. The heart of Akita was never really the fire falling from the sky. Read the messages again, and you will notice that the frightening images are always attached to a way out. If men do not repent. The word if is doing enormous work in that sentence. The warning is conditional, and the remedy the voice offered was almost embarrassingly simple. Pray the rosary. Do penance. Offer your small sufferings for other people. Pray for the church's own priests and bishops, especially when they are failing. For all its severity, that is not a message of despair. It assumes that ordinary prayer, from ordinary people, still changes things. There is a line associated with Akita that the sisters have held onto through all of it, a promise as plain as the warning was severe. Those who place their confidence in me will be saved. For 50 years, that is the sentence the people closest to this story have chosen to end on. Out of a message full of fire and desolation, the line they hold onto is a promise of rescue. Whether you take Akita as a genuine message from heaven, or as the sincere experience of a suffering woman that the church examined with unusual care, one fact is not in dispute. A bishop looked at all of it, for years, and decided it was worthy of belief. In a church that says no, far more often than it says yes, that alone should make you stop and pay attention. And we are only at the beginning. Because the story of what Sister Agnes said and saw did not end in 1984, and some of what came later is stranger and more disputed than anything you have heard so far.